Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Red dust rose across the African plateau as ox-drawn wagons creaked north under the burning sun. At their head rode Cecil John Rhodes, a man who believed the British Empire was destined to stretch from Cape to Cairo. To him, the land was not a home, but an unfinished map. Through charters, treaties, and guns, he built a company state in his own name, Rhodesia. It was not christened after a people or a river, but after its conqueror. Behind his dream of civilization came a slow captivity for the Shona and Ndebele, who were pushed into barren tribal trust lands stripped of water rights and history. By the early 1900s, Rhodesia looked like a fragment of England transplanted into the savannah. The settlers built Salisbury, with lawns, theaters, cricket fields, and a church on every corner, a pocket of empire surrounded by dust. They called themselves pioneers, bringers of order to a wild land. Yet outside the fences, silence ruled. Africans worked soil they did not own, asked permission to cross ancestral ground, and watched strangers fence off the graves of their forefathers. In 1923, Britain granted self-government to southern Rhodesia, a gift meant only for whites. Black citizens had no vote, no voice, no share in the laws that ruled them. Every young white man was required to serve. Every black man was required to obey. By World War II, thousands of Rhodesians fought for Britain overseas and returned home proud, yet uneasy. They had fought for freedom in Europe only to find none in Africa. After the war, independence movements swept across the continent. Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya. One after another, the old colonies broke free. In Rhodesia, black teachers, preachers, and clerks began to whisper the same question, why not us? They formed organizations, the Southern Rhodesia African National Congress, then the National Democratic Party, demanding land reform education and the right to vote. Their leaders spoke of peace and equality. Across the ocean, Martin Luther King praised their courage. But inside Salisbury's parliament, white politicians dismissed them as radicals. When Prime Minister Garfield Todd tried to loosen segregation, his own party removed him. Too soft on the natives, they said. Every attempt at reform was outlawed, every leader jailed. When peaceful roads closed, new movements were born in exile: ZAPU under Joshua Nkomo, backed by Moscow, and ZANU under the young Robert Mugabe, inspired by Mao, and the dream of armed liberation. To the white minority, they were terrorists. To the black majority, they were the first real hope in generations. Still, the settlers clung to their self-image, a frontier garrison defending civilization at the edge of chaos. They farmed, hunted, and sent their sons to war schools, believing themselves the last guardians of the empire's light. But the empire itself was fading. In 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan stood in Cape Town and declared that the wind of change is blowing through Africa. In Rhodesia, that wind sounded like a warning. It whispered that time was no longer on their side. When London began pushing for black majority rule, Salisbury pushed back. Ian Smith, a former RAF pilot turned politician, saw compromise as surrender. On November 11, 1965, he stood before the cameras and announced the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, declaring Rhodesia sovereign under God and true to the heritage of the West. He believed history would thank him, but the world turned away. The United Nations condemned him. Britain severed ties. Even allies stayed silent. Rhodesia was now a rogue nation, too white to belong to Africa, too rebellious to belong to Europe. Inside the country, the mood was triumphant. Church bells rang, champagne bottles popped. Newspapers called it Freedom Day. Yet beyond the fences, black Rhodesians watched in silence. They knew what independence meant: not freedom, but a cage that had closed from within. Rhodesia had built its prison out of pride, bright, orderly, and airless. The morning after independence, the white towns of Rhodesia woke to calm streets and full shelves. The newspapers called it victory. The churches called it destiny. But beyond the horizon, the rest of the world was closing its doors. Britain broke relations. The United Nations voted for sanctions. The embargo spread like a slow constriction: no oil, no trade, no recognition. Rhodesia became an island in the heart of a continent that no longer wanted its company. Inside the country, the Smith government turned siege into identity. We can stand alone, they told themselves. The world needs our tobacco, our chrome, our courage. Every citizen was drafted into the national myth. Men drilled on weekends, women sewed uniforms, teenagers trained with rifles beside cricket bats. On the surface, it looked like unity. Underneath it was fear disguised as patriotism. The sanctions forced invention. Engineers learned to refine fuel from coal. Factories produced parts they used to import. The economy adapted, but the cost was psychological. Isolation hardened the population. The white minority told itself it was chosen a small fortress of civilization surrounded by barbarism. And yet in the black townships, another kind of belief was forming. The dream of liberation was no longer whispered, it was organized. Across the border in Zambia and Tanzania, exiled members of ZANU and ZAPU built their first training camps. Young men crossed the Zambezi at night barefoot and half-starved carrying Chinese rifles and Soviet pamphlets. Most never made it far. Rhodesian patrols hunted them down, and when captured, their bodies were displayed as warnings. But the point was not victory, it was defiance. To fight the growing insurgency, Rhodesia forged one of the most disciplined militaries in Africa. The Rhodesian Light Infantry perfected rapid response raids. The Selous Scouts were created a secretive unit of soldiers trained to infiltrate guerrilla groups by disguising themselves as the enemy. Their methods were brutal, their success undeniable. "We are fighting with intelligence and imagination," boasted the newspapers. Few spoke of the fear behind the efficiency. The early battles were small, but bloody. In 1967, guerrillas from ZIPRA and South Africa's ANC crossed near Hwange National Park. They were intercepted and annihilated. Another group was hunted down near Karoi, their camps destroyed from the air. Each skirmish reaffirmed the government's conviction we can contain this. But every funeral, every reprisal sent more recruits north. Diplomacy offered brief, hollow interludes. British Prime Minister Harold Wilson tried to negotiate aboard the HMS Tiger in 1966 and again on the HMS Fearless in 1968. Each time Smith refused to yield on majority rule. "Never in 1,000 years," he said, smiling for the cameras. Each rejection deepened the country's isolation. Each victory was another lock on the cage. By the early 1970s, Rhodesia was a paradox, militarily strong, politically doomed. Sanctions had not broken its economy, but they had eroded its friends. The Portuguese in Mozambique and Angola were losing their colonial wars. South Africa, once a silent ally, was weary of being seen as Rhodesia's shield. And then in December 1972, the illusion of control shattered. On a quiet night near Centenary, a small group of Zanla guerrillas led by Rex Nongo crept onto a white-owned property called Altina Farm. They fired a few rounds, wounding the owner, and melted back into the bush. Militarily, it was insignificant, a broken window, a few drops of blood. But to both sides, it meant everything. For the guerrillas, it was the first shot of a new war proof that Rhodesia could bleed inside its borders. For the settlers, it was the moment the siege stopped being metaphor. Convoys began running daily. Checkpoints sprouted on rural roads. Farmers slept with shotguns by the door. The government called for calm, but everyone knew the truth: the bush was awake. The cage had not been breached from outside, it had begun to crumble from within. For nearly a decade, Rhodesia had fought to keep the war outside its walls. Then in 1974, the walls themselves disappeared. A revolution in Lisbon toppled Portugal's dictatorship, and with it, the colonial empire that had shielded Rhodesia's eastern flank. Overnight, Mozambique was free, and its new leader, Samora Machel, made his choice clear Rhodesia's enemies would find sanctuary on his soil. For Ian Smith's government, it was an earthquake. Mozambique's 400-kilometer border turned from buffer to battlefield. Air routes to the sea vanished. Oil pipelines were cut. The small, defiant republic was suddenly surrounded on three sides by hostile states: Zambia to the north, Mozambique to the east, Botswana to the south. The siege had become encirclement. For Zanla, it was rebirth. The Mozambican frontier offered what Zambia never could: proximity to home. Guerrillas could cross the border on foot, vanish into the bush, and return with recruits before sunrise. With Chinese instructors guiding them, they built training camps that doubled as schools. Recruits learned Marxist theory and military drill, side by side, reading by candlelight under the hum of cicadas. In villages across eastern Rhodesia, cadres arrived not as strangers, but as sons teaching politics, distributing food, singing liberation songs in the language of the people. Each new camp became a seed. By late 1975, ZANU had carved a corridor of control stretching deep into the countryside. Their war was not about territory, but about trust. The people are the water, they said, and we are the fish. Inside Salisbury, panic mixed with pride. The government doubled down. Conscription expanded to 18 months. Protected villages were built, entire black communities fenced in and watched by armed guards supposedly for their own safety. In truth, they were prisons meant to starve the guerrillas of food and shelter. By 1976, Rhodesia was fighting a war on three fronts against the insurgents, against the world, and against time. The army grew ruthless. Its special units, the Selous Scouts, the SAS, and the RLI, were unleashed across the borders. Helicopters thudded over the Zambezi. Bombers crossed into Mozambique disguised as Allied aircraft. On August 9, 1976, one such operation changed everything. Before dawn, an elite Rhodesian team disguised as Frelimo soldiers entered the Nyadzonya camp in Mozambique, a sprawling base that housed not only guerrillas, but hundreds of refugees. They gathered the crowd for what seemed like a roll call, then opened fire. The massacre lasted minutes. Over 1,000 people were killed, men, women, and children. The Rhodesian press called it a triumph. The world called it murder. For the first time, Rhodesia was not merely isolated, it was condemned. South Africa, once its lifeline, began to recoil. Prime Minister John Vorster, under global pressure to soften apartheid, could no longer defend a partner seen as a pariah. South African pilots and funding were quietly withdrawn. Even Washington took notice. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger warned Smith that the West would no longer shield a regime fighting against history. Inside the country, fatigue deepened. White mothers clipped casualty lists from newspapers. Farmers along the eastern frontier slept with rifles beside their children's beds. The sound of helicopters, once comforting, now meant loss. For the black majority, the war had become something else entirely. What began as rebellion was turning into revolution. Each atrocity strengthened resolve. In the villages, elders told stories of Nyadzonya, like sacred testimony. They fear us, one said. That means they are near their end. By the end of 1976, Rhodesia stood alone, smaller, poorer, more desperate than ever. Yet Smith still appeared on television, jaw clenched, insisting victory was near. Behind him, the map of Rhodesia glowed red under the studio lights, a country surrounded by its own shadow. The door that once led outward to empire, to trade, to pride, now opened inward into darkness. By 1977, the war had consumed everything. The bush was no longer a frontier, it was everywhere. Roads that once carried tobacco and cattle now carried convoys of armored trucks. Farmers traveled in groups. Children learned to recognize the distant rhythm of mortars before they learned arithmetic. The map of Rhodesia had turned into a chessboard of fear, every district marked with raids, reprisals, and rumors. The government called it tightening security. What it meant was control through exhaustion, curfews after dark, passes for every black worker, roadblocks manned by teenage conscripts with trembling hands. Salisbury became an island of false calm where jazz clubs still played to half-empty rooms, and the newspapers printed victory headlines above lists of the dead. ZANU and ZAPU, meanwhile, had become armies. Tens of thousands trained in camps across Mozambique and Zambia. Soviet trucks delivered mortars and rocket launchers. Chinese advisors taught ambush tactics and guerrilla politics. The two factions still distrusted each other, Shona, an Ndebele Maoist and Marxist, but for now their enemy was the same. Every month the number of attacks inside Rhodesia doubled. Every month another district slipped from white control. The Rhodesian response grew darker. Intelligence units drew up kill lists. Villages suspected of harboring guerrillas were burned. The Selous Scouts began operating without uniforms, infiltrating communities, planting mines, executing suspected sympathizers at night. "We fight like ghosts," one soldier said, "because we are fighting ghosts." In November 1977, the army crossed into Mozambique again, Operation Dingo. For 2 days, helicopters and bombers pounded the Chimoio, and Tembu camps, killing between 1 and 3,000 people. Officially, it was another victory, but to the outside world, it was slaughter. Western newspapers printed photos of dead children beneath headlines like Rhodesia's hidden war. The mask had slipped. The multiracial democracy Rhodesia claimed to defend was now revealed as a besieged minority fighting to preserve its place atop a collapsing system. And yet, even as condemnation grew, so did defiance. Smith's government believed brutality could buy time enough for a negotiated settlement that kept white control intact. In March 1978, he signed the internal settlement with moderate black leaders such as Bishop Abel Muzorewa. It promised elections and power sharing, but excluded Mugabe and Nkomo and their armies. The world saw through it immediately. The UN refused recognition. The guerrillas called it a sham. Still, Rhodesia pressed on, hoping that a new flag and a new name, Zimbabwe Rhodesia, could mask the old reality. But the war did not pause for politics. In September 1978, a Zipra missile struck Air Rhodesia Flight 825, a civilian Viscount airliner. 38 passengers died in the crash. The survivors were executed at the site. 5 months later, a second plane was shot down. The white population was horrified. The black population divided, some condemning others, calling it the cost of liberation. As the violence escalated, so did desperation. On December 12, 1978, ZANU commandos struck the oil depot in Salisbury, setting off explosions that turned the night sky into an inferno. Half the nation's fuel reserves burned away in a single night. The city woke to black smoke drifting over its spires, the smell of inevitability. By 1979, the war had entered its final fever. The Rhodesian army, though still formidable, was stretched to breaking point. Every able-bodied white man under 38 was conscripted for 6 months of service each year. Even schoolboys were drafted for guard duty. The economy, once proud of self-reliance, choked under sanctions and fear. At last, Smith relented. In September 1979, under pressure from London, Washington, and Pretoria, all sides agreed to meet in London at Lancaster House. Rhodesia's last prime minister arrived in a dark suit, his confidence cracked but not broken. Across the table sat Mugabe and Nkomo and the exiled leaders he had spent years calling terrorists. They spoke through translators, diplomats, and ghosts. Every word was weighed against 15 years of blood. Outside the conference hall, winter rain streaked the windows of Whitehall, soft, relentless, and indifferent. Rhodesia's long night was ending not with surrender, but with exhaustion. The empire's last rebel colony had finally unraveled. Winter fog wrapped around London when the delegates arrived at Lancaster House. Ian Smith stepped into the hall, flanked by advisors in gray suits, the same man who once promised white rule not in 1,000 years. Across from him sat Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo, men who had spent those same years in exile, prison, and war. Between them, the British sought to choreograph the empire's final act. Every session was a duel fought with words instead of bullets. The Rhodesians wanted guarantees protection for white farmers, reserved seats in parliament, and amnesty for their soldiers. The nationalists wanted recognition elections and the end of minority rule. The British, desperate to avoid another Angola, tried to hold the room together with tea and protocol. Outside Londoners walked past the mansion without noticing, but inside a century of empire sat heavy in the air. Mugabe, calm and deliberate, insisted that the war had already decided everything. "You can't negotiate gravity," one diplomat recalled him saying. "Rhodesia is falling." The talks dragged on for weeks. Each day began with cautious optimism, ended with silence and cigarettes. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Mozambique and Zambia were collapsing under the weight of refugees. South Africa, cornered by sanctions, urged Smith to compromise. Even the Americans warned that without settlement, the entire region could ignite. On December 21, 1979, they signed. The Lancaster House Agreement ended the war. Rhodesia would return to temporary British control supervised by Commonwealth observers. Elections would follow within 3 months. 20% of parliament seats would be reserved for whites, a face-saving gesture for a vanishing order. When the ink dried, the war was over, but peace had not yet begun. Guerrillas were ordered to gather at assembly points. Rhodesian troops returned to their barracks. The two armies stared at each other across wire fences, each pretending the other didn't exist. In March 1980, Zimbabwe held its first election. The line stretched for miles, farmers, teachers, miners, and mothers who had never before cast a vote. When the results came, there was no surprise Mugabe's ZANU PF had won by a landslide. In the capital, fireworks burst over Salisbury, soon to be renamed Harare. Ian Smith, watching from his home, called it the end of civilization. For millions of others, it was the beginning of something uncertain, fragile, and long overdue. In the first months of independence, Zimbabwe felt like a dream realized. Guerrillas laid down their weapons and marched through the streets singing. Children waved flags stitched from old uniforms. Even Mugabe spoke of reconciliation. Let us turn our swords into plowshares. But beneath the speeches, the fractures remained. The army was a patchwork of enemies forced into one uniform. The country itself, scarred by landmines, burned villages, and buried hatred waited to see what peace would cost. The war had ended, but peace came armed. When Robert Mugabe took power, he inherited a country rich in promise and wrecked by violence. The roads were cratered, the fields mined, and the villages emptied by fear. Yet in those early months of 1980, the air carried something electric, a belief that history had finally turned. Teachers returned to ruined classrooms writing new alphabets of freedom on cracked chalkboards. Farmers walked their land as if seeing it for the first time. For a brief moment, Zimbabwe became the miracle of Africa. The economy surged, schools multiplied. The flag of the new republic fluttered over the same buildings that once bore the Union Jack. Mugabe's speeches spoke of forgiveness. Even some white settlers, too weary to flee, began to hope they might belong to this new nation after all. But history in Rhodesia, as in all empires, does not disappear, it mutates. The unity of the liberation struggle fractured under the weight of power. The Zanla and Zipra armies, once allies against the Smith regime, turned on each other. In 1983, Mugabe unleashed the North Korean-trained 5th Brigade in the western provinces, accusing Nkomo's supporters of plotting rebellion. What followed was silence, the kind that comes after gunfire. Villages in Matabeleland were burned. Thousands were executed or disappeared. The campaign known as Gukurahundi was meant to wash away the chaff before the rains. It became one of independent Africa's darkest stains. By the end of the 1980s, Mugabe stood unchallenged, a liberator turned ruler for life. The war that had promised freedom had delivered another kind of captivity. Farms were seized, critics imprisoned, journalists silenced. Inflation devoured the currency. Hunger returned to the countryside. The cage had changed hands but not shape, and yet Zimbabwe endured. Generations born after the war carried its memory not as a story of heroes and villains, but as a caution how revolution left unchecked becomes the mirror of the power it destroys. Today, in the ruins of old Rhodesian outposts, the bush has reclaimed the airstrips. The fences have rusted, the minefields grown over with wild grass. Children play where soldiers once fought. They do not remember the slogans of Ian Smith or Robert Mugabe. They remember the land, the red soil, the smell of rain, the songs that outlast governments. Rhodesia was built on a dream of permanence. Zimbabwe was born from the refusal to accept it. Both were shaped by the same truth: no nation owns time. Empires fall, flags fade, names change, but the land remains. And in the wind that sweeps across the high veld, you can still hear the sound of an empire collapsing and a people trying again and again to be free.